6,000 exhausted soldiers, 15,000 French knights in gleaming armor, a muddy field in northern France where every military calculation said the English would be crushed before noon. The French outnumbered them, outweighed them, had spent the night feasting while the English shivered in rain-soaked darkness. October 25th, 1415, should have been a massacre. It was just not the one anyone expected. This wasn't simply about survival. This was the moment a bankrupt kingdom's desperate gamble would either validate a young king's claim to greatness or erase England's military reputation forever. Behind that thin line of archers stood everything: legitimacy, honor, the future of a dynasty. Beyond them, the flower of French chivalry, eager to avenge years of humiliation and teach these island raiders what happened to armies foolish enough to march deep into France. What unfolded in the next 3 hours involved mud that swallowed armored men whole, arrows that fell like steel rain, and a battlefield where technology and terrain conspired to turn medieval warfare inside out, where nobility drowned in French soil while commoners with bows rewrote the rules of war. To understand how a stretch of plowed farmland became a graveyard for chivalry, you have to picture France in the autumn of 1415. Not the France of map lines and treaties, but the actual earth, sodden from weeks of rain, roads dissolving into rivers of mud, fields turned to swamps. And through this drowning landscape, an English army was dying by degrees. They had marched from Harfleur with 8,000 men. The siege had lasted 5 brutal weeks. Dysentery carved through the ranks. 2,000 died before they even left the walls. Now 6,000 stumbled north toward Calais, boots disintegrating, bellies empty, the sickness turning the column into a nightmare of human misery. King Henry V rode among them, 28 years old, burning with fever, watching his invasion dissolve with every mile. The French knew it. For 2 weeks they tracked the English retreat, letting distance and disease do their work. No need to risk battle when your enemy was already beaten. Let them reach the Somme and find every ford blocked. Let hunger and exhaustion do what swords might fail to accomplish. But Henry kept moving. When the Somme proved impassable, he turned east, marching 60 desperate miles until scouts found an unguarded causeway. The army crossed in a single rush, knights and archers wading through water up to their chests, expecting French lances at any moment. None came. By the time French commanders realized what happened, the English were across and racing north again. Now there was no choice. The French host gathered itself, a glittering assemblage of everything that made medieval France powerful. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, commanded. With him rode the Dukes of Orleans, Bourbon, and Alençon, the greatest names in French nobility, knights who had trained for war since childhood, encased in the finest plate armor Italian craftsmen could forge, horses bred for size and strength, crossbowmen by the thousands, men-at-arms whose fathers had crushed English armies before. They caught Henry on October 24th, near the village of Agincourt. The English saw them crest a ridge to the north, a wall of steel and banners stretching across the horizon, blocking the road to Calais. Someone counted the pennants and stopped at 300 nobles. Henry's heralds rode forward under truce flags. The message was desperate. Let us pass, and there would be no battle. Henry would give up everything captured at Harfleur. He would swear not to return for 7 years. The French laughed, not metaphorically. Chronicles record actual laughter echoing across the valley. Why accept scraps when total victory was one charge away? The heralds rode back with the answer written in contempt. There would be battle. Tomorrow, right here, that night. The two armies camped within sight of each other. The French built fires that turned their encampment into a field of stars. Wine flowed, dice rolled. Knights wagered on who would capture the English king. He was worth a fortune in ransom. Some played cards for the right to claim specific English nobles as prisoners. Music drifted across the valley. This wasn't an army preparing for war. This was an army celebrating a victory they hadn't won, but considered inevitable. In the English camp, men sat in darkness. Henry had forbidden fires. No point advertising their misery. Soldiers checked bowstrings in silence, knowing they'd be useless if the rain continued. Knights inspected armor held together with improvised repairs. Priests moved through the ranks, hearing confessions. Many men wrote final messages, handing scraps of parchment to comrades with instructions to deliver them if anyone survived. Henry walked the lines that night, not riding, walking, stopping to speak with archers who'd marched 400 miles in broken boots, sitting beside men-at-arms too sick to stand but determined to fight, asking names, listening to stories. When dawn came, every soldier in that camp knew their king would stand with them, not behind them, with them. October 25th broke cold and gray. Rain had stopped, but the ground held every drop from 3 weeks of storms. The battlefield chose itself, 1,000 yards of recently plowed farmland, squeezed between two woods. At the northern end, the French assembled in 3 massive formations, dismounted knights in front, so many they could barely fit between the tree lines, cavalry on the wings, more men-at-arms behind, a third line in reserve, 15,000 men, perhaps more. At the southern end, Henry deployed his entire army in a single line, no reserve, no second wave, everything committed to one thin formation, 3 or 4 ranks deep at most, knights and men-at-arms in the center, archers on the flanks, angled slightly forward, so their arrows could converge in crossfire. Behind each archer, a sharpened wooden stake driven into the soft earth at an angle, points facing outward. 6,000 men stretched across 400 yards. From the French position, they must have looked like a line drawn in ink, thin, fragile, ready to be erased. The gap between the armies measured nearly 1,000 yards. Neither side moved. The French waited for the English to attack, to exhaust themselves charging uphill through mud. Henry waited for the French to come to him, knowing his starving soldiers couldn't sustain a long advance. Hours passed. The sun climbed. Men shifted weight from foot to foot. Horses stamped. Still nobody moved. Finally, near mid-morning, Henry made the decision that would decide everything. He ordered the advance. The entire English line stepped forward, a crawling march across 600 yards of plowed field that sucked at every step. Knights in full armor sank to their ankles. Archers carrying stake bundles struggled through soil that clung like concrete. It took half an hour to cross 2/3 of the field. When they reached roughly 300 yards from the French line, Henry called the halt. The archers drove their stakes into the ground, a makeshift palisade of pointed wood. Then they drew their bows. 6,000 longbows, each capable of piercing armor at close range, each able to lose 10 to 12 arrows per minute. The first arrows arced upward into the gray sky. The storm that fell on the French vanguard wasn't aimed at fire. It was saturation. A steel rain so dense that individual arrows became irrelevant. 70,000 arrows in the first minute. Another 70,000 in the second. The French response was everything Henry had gambled on. Waiting was no longer possible. Not under that murderous hail. The mounted wings spurred forward, lances leveled. The dismounted center began its advance. The greatest army France had assembled in a generation lurched into motion, and the mud greeted them like an enemy. The cavalry went first. Destriers bred for strength, carrying riders in full plate, horse and man together weighing close to a ton. They hit the soft ground at a gallop, and within 50 yards a charge began to disintegrate. Horses floundered. Some fell. Others simply stopped, legs buried to the knees, unable to pull free. Riders who managed to stay mounted found themselves crawling forward at a walk, while arrows thudded into horseflesh and found gaps in armor. The few who reached the English stakes died there, horses impaling themselves on wooden points. Riders pitched forward into the mud or cut down by archers wielding mallets and hatchets. Behind them came the dismounted knights, 10,000 men in the finest armor in Europe, advancing in formation across ground that fought every step. The mud wasn't just soft, it was adhesive. Each step required pulling your foot free of suction that could yank a boot off entirely. Men who fell couldn't rise without help. Armor that weighed 60 pounds in normal conditions became an anchor. Visors that provided protection also restricted vision and breathing. Within 200 yards, the advance had slowed to a struggling crawl, and the arrows kept falling. English archers could see the French were in trouble. They shifted from high arcing volleys to direct fire, flatter trajectories, closer range, targeting joints and vision slits. Arrows punched through armor weakened by previous impacts. Men dropped, wounded, or dead. Others stumbled over them. The formation compressed, knights bunching together as the front ranks slowed. Discipline dissolved. The proud advance became a mob of armored men fighting the earth as much as the enemy. When the French vanguard finally reached the English line, they arrived not as a coordinated assault, but as individual knights, exhausted, gasping for air inside helmets that had become suffocating, barely able to lift weapons. They crashed into English men-at-arms who were fresh, unarmored or lightly armored, and holding position. The collision looked dramatic. Steel on steel, noble combat. The reality was butchery. Knights too exhausted to fight effectively, weighed down by armor and mud, surrounded by English soldiers wielding hammers, poleaxes, and daggers specifically designed to defeat plate armor. The compression became catastrophic. French knights still arriving from behind pushed forward, unable to see that the front ranks had stalled. Bodies piled against the English line. Men fell and couldn't rise because others fell on top of them. The mud and the weight and the pressure created a nightmare where knights suffocated inside their own armor, drowned in 2 inches of water and soil, and were crushed by the press of their own comrades. The French second line arrived and made it worse. More men pushing into the same narrow space. The woods on either side prevented any flanking movement. The entire army funneled into a killing ground barely 400 yards wide. English archers, having exhausted their arrow supplies, abandoned their bows, grabbed whatever weapons were available, and joined the melee. They swarmed the flanks of the French formation, attacking men too packed together to defend themselves effectively. For 3 hours, the killing continued. Not glorious combat, not the chivalric warfare French knights had trained for, just exhausted men slaughtering exhausted men in a field that had become a mass grave. The Duke of Alençon fought his way almost to Henry himself before being cut down. The Duke of Brabant arrived late with reinforcements. Couldn't find his armor. Charged into battle, wearing improvised gear, and died within minutes. The Constable d'Albret died somewhere in the press. Accounts differ on exactly how, because by that point individual deaths had lost meaning. Then something happened that would stain the day's legend. English soldiers had been taking prisoners, capturing knights who could be ransomed for enormous sums. The English camp, lightly guarded, contained hundreds of French nobles under minimal supervision. A French force threatened the English rear. Henry, seeing his baggage under attack and fearing a coordinated prisoner revolt from behind, gave an order that chronicles still debate: kill the prisoners. Many English soldiers refused. Killing unarmed captive nobles violated every code of chivalry and cost them potential fortunes. Henry detailed archers to carry out the order. The executions took precious minutes. By the time they were complete, the French threat had dissolved. The attack on the camp was a raid, not a coordinated assault. The third French line, seeing the destruction ahead, never engaged. They withdrew, leaving the field to the English and the dead. When silence finally settled, the scale of what happened became visible. French bodies covered the field so completely that in places you couldn't see ground between them. Conservative estimates put French dead at 6,000, roughly the entire English army size. Some contemporary accounts claim 10,000. Modern historians think 7,000 to 8,000 is likely. English casualties, a few hundred at most. Entire noble families were erased in a single afternoon. The Duke of Brabant, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, the Constable d'Albret, 3 bishops, 90 barons. The list of noble dead read like a roll call of French power. The prisoners eventually numbered more than 1,000, so many that the English army, already struggling with disease and exhaustion, could barely guard them on the march to Calais. Some nobles were worth their weight in gold. The Duke of Orleans' ransom eventually cost France enough to fund a small war. But the real cost wasn't measured in gold. France had lost a generation of military leadership in 3 hours. The great names that had commanded French armies, defended French territories, maintained French military supremacy, gone. Henry's army limped into Calais days later, sick, starving, carrying wounds that would kill many before they reached England. But they had done the impossible. They had marched across France, been trapped by an army 3 times their size, and turned certain annihilation into legendary victory. When news reached England, church bells rang for days. When news reached France, it was met with disbelief, then mourning, then recriminations that would poison French politics for years. Agincourt didn't end the war. Fighting would continue for another generation, but it fundamentally altered how that war would be fought. The longbow, already respected, became the English weapon, the tool that let common archers kill armored nobility. The battle demonstrated that terrain could matter more than numbers, that armor wasn't invincibility, that technology and tactics could overcome traditional hierarchy. French commanders would spend decades trying to develop counters to English archery. For Henry, Agincourt became valid. He had claimed the throne of France based on disputed genealogy and questionable legal arguments. Now, he had proven his claim in blood. The young king who'd been dismissed as reckless, who'd invaded France with an undersized army, who'd gambled everything on a campaign that military logic said would fail, he had won. Not through luck, through forcing his enemy to fight on ground in terms that negated their advantages, through understanding that a muddy field between two woods could become a killing ground, through trusting that 6,000 exhausted men with longbows could defeat 15,000 knights if those knights had to wade through hell to reach them. The field between the woods fell quiet as dusk approached. French survivors stumbled away, leaving behind armor, weapons, banners, everything that could slow their retreat. English soldiers moved through the carnage, finishing wounded enemies by necessity, stripping valuables by practicality. The nobility of France lay scattered across plowed earth, mixed with mud and rain, until steel and flesh were barely distinguishable from soil. Henry walked the battlefield that evening, not in triumph. Chronicles emphasize his somber demeanor. He stopped beside a pile of French dead, nobles he probably dined with during peacetime, men whose ransoms could have made him wealthy. They had died in their finest armor, pursuing the kind of glorious combat their entire lives had prepared them for, and the mud had swallowed them. Wars turn on moments like these, moments where confidence meets reality and shatters, where assumptions about power and superiority prove fatally wrong. The French had believed, had known with certainty, that their numbers, their armor, their nobility made victory inevitable. The English had believed that desperation, position, and 6 feet of you might be enough to survive. Neither side fully understood what would happen when those beliefs collided in 1,000 yards of October mud. Agincourt stood, the English departed, and behind them, the flower of French chivalry remained in soil that had become their tomb, proof that sometimes the ground beneath your feet matters more than the steel on your back, and that technology in the hands of common men can rewrite the rules that nobles thought were written in iron.